So now let's look at the way that HTML and CSS can help us build applications directly in the web. In this module, I'm going to show you some HTML and CSS basics, including describing what HTML is, describing how CSS works with HTML, and how to lay out pages using both HTML and CSS. Let's get started. It's important that when you're building web applications or websites that you understand how layout and composition works on the web. Before you can make them all dynamic, going back to basics and understanding how a simple angle bracket markup plus a new language for design builds with small components up your big projects. So let's start with the simple. What is HTML? Hypertext Markup Language, which is the term for HTML, is an angle-based structured language that is derived from HTML. So there is a notion of beginning and end tags, as well as a parent-child relationship between the levels of those beginning and end tags. You can see the HTML and /HTML start and end the HTML document, and that the head and body specify sections of the HTML, and then individual tags are using the same moniker. Just because we're using angle brackets to define this doesn't mean that HTML is XML. This is an important idea for you to get comfortable with. HTML, unlike XML, is not case sensitive and has mixed closing rules. Whereas XML always allows you to either self-close an element like you see in the image tag here, or to have a beginning and ending element, as you see in body and script and head. In HTML, certain tags have to be closed with self-closing. Certain tags can only be closed with an opening and closing tag. Learning those differences is crucial to writing good HTML, but I'll show you how to debug that when you do get it wrong. So let's build some basic HTML. If we come back to Visual Studio, this will be the same place we ended the last module. If you remember, we had an index.html file, and let's go ahead and just double click it to open it. And we had started with just this h1 tag. I'll talk a little bit about the head and the body as we go on, but for the most part, the body is going to be what you're going to see inside the browser window itself. If we launch the browser for a minute, I'm doing this by hitting Control F5. We can see that it contains just this h1. Now, h1 is a tag that derives from the original idea of HTML as simply a series of markup tags to help people format. The h1 has a corresponding h2, h3, h4, and h5 for different levels of headings. In the same way, there are paragraphs, and there are horizontal lines, and other things that will help you structure your HTML like a document. If we come back and add a P, which is a paragraph tag, we can then add some text in a form of just textual information that will be displayed like a paragraph. This is going to be a site where we can buy Dutch artists' merchandise. If we come back over here to the browser and refresh, we'll see that h1 continues to display, but it knows there's going to be some simple text underneath it. If we return and change this h1 to h2, and you'll notice that when we change a tag in Visual Studio, it fixes the end tag for us as long as it's well formed. Back in the browser, when we refresh, we'll see it still is bolded like a header might be, but it's a little smaller. And this goes all the way down from h1 all the way to h6. Another kind of structure which we might be interested in is an ordered list. That starts with the OL tag for ordered list, and then has these things called list items. And I'm just going to create a couple of these. And so the ordered list has a collection of these list items. Refreshing the browser, we can see that ordered lists are what they sound like. They're just numbered lists. These list items are used for different kinds of lists, including UL, which is unordered list, which is also a pretty common structure you're going to use. You can see these are bulleted instead of numbered because they're unordered. They don't have numbering because there isn't an order specified to them, though they'll always be in the order of the list items. Another important idea within HTML markup is being able to format individual items within other structures. So if I was going to change this, I could make the going bolded. I could surround it with tags that specify strong. That is the nomenclature in HTML for bold. If we refresh, we can see that going is now bold. It also allows us to do the same kind of thing to create links. Of course, the web is rich in links. When you click on things, it'll take you to other pages or other parts of a website. And we can do that by adding something called an anchor. Anchor starts with an A, is the name of the tag, and then we're introduced to one of the first concepts about these structured elements. And that is the idea that within the elements, we can also have what are called attributes. These are properties of that tag. One of the first ones you run into is href, which is an attribute of the anchor tag. This is where I could tell it to go to some website. And if we refresh, we'll get that familiar underlined with the different color saying we're going someplace else. And here in the bottom left corner, it'll even give us a preview of where that link takes us. So this is all interesting, but let's build something real. I'm going to leave that H2 there, and I want to build something that more represents the kind of information we're going to show. So the first thing I want to do is build something called a div. A div is just a block that can be formatted. And so div is a structural element, but it really doesn't have a display idea around it. It's really a way to say, I have some information on the screen. And for example, we're going to show you something that looks similar to a product listing on our website. And so we use div to say this is one sort of structure, one sort of reusable element in our HTML. The first thing I want to do is use a new tag called image. An image is one of those that requires you to have a closing tag at the end. It can't have an image tag that is like that. It'll actually give you a little hint here in saying closing tag for self-closing element doesn't work. So we have to have it what they call self-closing. This is where we can specify the source of some file. Now we don't have any images in our project yet, but let's go ahead and create a new directory, and we'll just call it img. And then let's go ahead and add an existing file. And if you go to the project file that's on the bottom of the screen here, it's a GitHub repository that contains the resources for this project. It'll be a folder that looks very, very similar or exactly the same as this. And all we're going to do is open up that image directory and use Control-A to select all and add them into that directory. It's copied all of these from one place to another, and you'll see we have all these files now. What we really want is this vango.jpg. So if we start typing, we can see that we're going to get help finding this file. And that's what we wanted to say, /image/vango.jpg. Like we learned in the last module, this www root directory is the root of our website. And so that we can assume that /img is going to take us directly to this www root directory, and then we're going to find that file inside of img. In fact, we can make this a little easier. Let's delete this. And if we come down here to the end where vango.jpg is, we can actually drag it into the right place, and it'll copy it, including the full path. That makes it a little easier to bring in files. Next, we want a small heading inside of our div for the kind of object it is. And we're going to put this Van Gogh image on a mug. That's going to be one of the products we sell. And then we're going to want a list of different attributes about the mug. So I'm going to create a list item, price, artist, title, and we're going to leave that one blank. And description, we'll just say a self-portrait. If we show this in the browser, we can see that this div represents this entire section here. And so far it's pretty ugly because we haven't done any layout or any styling to it, but we'll get there in a minute. It's a good start. The last thing we need down here is a button. We'll just make it a little buy button for now. There's a couple different ways of making buttons, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But for the most part, we can just live with this being a simple button. Here in the browser, we can now see the beautiful buy button. So one of the basic tenets of what we see here is that if you remember what the HTML looks like, we have the title, and then we have image and a mug, the unordered list, and then the buy. And here in the browser, it's exactly the same. That's because HTML is drawn top down. So unless we use something special to space or organize or change the way this natural structure is of drawing top down, that's exactly what happens here. That's why by default, we don't need any spacing or definition of where to put it on the page, because by default, it's going to try to draw it like a document. It's just going to lay things out in the order that we've laid them out. Let's look at some form elements, which are a big part of the HTML spec. We'll do that next. So next, let's talk about HTML forms. Back here in Visual Studio, let's add a couple blank lines, which actually don't show up in the resulting HTML. They're just so that it's a little easier for us to see the page. I'm going to start with a form element. Form is a special element that says I want to get information from the user. You may have noticed that all of this up here is really read-only data, stuff we're going to display to the user like we would in a Word document. But form is special in that we really expect this form to collect information from the user that we're then going to be able to send to some back-end component that we'll write later. And form itself has some of its own type of elements. The first I'll talk about is input. And I'm just going to put a plain self-closing input in there for now. And let's see what this looks like in the browser. This looks like just a box, but in fact, it's a text edit field. By default, the kind of input this is textual. Let's come back here and add another element called label. Label is, as you would expect, is a simple way to display data near inputs. Here in the browser, we can now see that it's giving that familiar left-right sort of version of it. Let's repeat this for password. We look at this in the browser. You can now see password, but of course it's showing that the password is something we could just see. It's probably not a good idea for security. So we come back here to the input. There's an attribute called type, and one of the types we can use is a password input. And the difference here is that as we type in it, it's going to hide the actual password implementation. From code, we can still look at the password and send it. It's just an affectation of the way it looks like to the user. So someone sneaking over the shoulder looking at a coworker's can't see that password. Also note that these have continued to show left to right. And they're doing this because each of these elements expects it to just be next to another item. And so to make this feel and look more like a form, let's just add a break in here. Break is really just a hard return or a carriage return line feed that you might be used to in the idea of an HTML document. And that way we can start to see this show up as something more interesting as a form. In fact, them being not even here makes me a little crazy. So let's actually put a break in between each one of them so that they're on separate lines. We'll make it a little prettier. Starting to look like a real form. But instead of a logon form, let's do one that will allow us to send an email. So let's make this your name, email. In fact, we can actually use an email input type here that will know that we want to be able to send something formatted as an email. Actually, it doesn't do a lot for us as far as validating it, but we'll look at what that's like later. Let's add another one for subject, and we can just make this text. Text is the default, so we don't actually need it. This input with the text type is identical to this input where it doesn't have a type specified. Then we can look at a new kind of form. Let's first add a label for message. And let's go ahead and put that break in there. And then we can use a new kind of element called a text area. Text area is like an input text, but it allows us to have more than one line. And for something like a message, that makes total sense. Now, text area specifies how big it is using rows and columns. So if I just add rows equal 4, I'm going to make sure that it's tall enough for at least 4 lines of text. Let's see what this looks like now. So the name, the email, the subject, those all look good, but something weird is going on in our message because we have these tags inside them. The reason that's happening, and this is something you'll run into, is that text area can't be self-closed. It has to have a closing tag instead. And so what happened when we just had the tag like this is that the browser assumed that this character was wrong and was going to put everything else in here inside the text area, searching for that ending tag that of course didn't exist. And this introduces an interesting idea about how browsers work, and that is they're going to take whatever HTML you're generating and they're going to attempt to guess what you're doing, whether you follow the HTML rules or not. You're not going to get parsing errors or any of those sorts of things that as developers would make us a little bit more comfortable. But the browser is going to say, if you've made a mistake, I want to do my best to try to guess what you really want. And that can cause you some headaches later, but it will allow you to at least show some of the form correctly. So now that we've added an end tag instead of the self-closing tag, we're now getting the form in a pretty good format. Let's add one more piece. This is going to be another input, but its type is going to be called submit. And for its value, I'm just going to say send message. The value allows me to specify what the value is for any of the inputs. So if I had put value for email and subject and name and all that, it would have used that as the contents of the text. Or if I'd put some text inside the text area between its opening and closing tags, it would have assumed that was the text. But this value is strange, and this is part of HTML's long, odd history. This value is actually what the submit button is going to have on it. This type submit, even though we're thinking about it as an input, is really the element that when pressed is going to take this data from the form and try to send it someplace. So let's see what this looks like in the browser. We now have that send message button, and if we put some text in each one of these, we press send message. First of all, some browsers are going to want a real email address there, so I'll go ahead and give it a real email address. And when we send message, it blinks and all the data goes away. Because what's happening is it's actually making a request back to the server, which of course we're not listening for, with all the data that I sent here. So later we'll take this example and actually make it work in our website as our contact us form. But we'll get to that in a little bit. Again, the same principles have applied, that you're drawing top down, you have different kinds of controls, you have interaction that you can use to do things. All of those things continue in the same way with HTML. Now, I've only brushed the very basics. There's a lot more elements that we may be interested in, but this will at least get your appetite whet. And as we go on, you'll see new and different kinds of structural information in HTML as we go by. But let's go and look at CSS. So when we talk about CSS, we're specifically talking about cascading style sheets. The cascading style sheets include the design of not only the page, but perhaps the entire web application. While you can embed styling directly into your HTML pages, the suggestion is to separate the structure of a web application, which you can see in the HTML, from the design elements or the rules for how to draw it, which would be done in CSS. So styling HTML can happen really at 3 levels. We can use style attributes on individual elements, but they typically are fragile. You can move this up and put all the styling for your web page into a style block on the individual web page. You can use a style block to style the entire page, but that has limits because it's only styling an individual page and not applying it or reusing it, more importantly, for the entire web application. So the suggestion is to actually use entire style sheets or files that end in .css that contain the styling for either an individual page, a component, or even an entire web app. Let's see what that looks like. If we go over to Visual Studio, we still have that HTML document open. Let's start with that. If I go to this first input, I can set an attribute on the input called style. Again, the word style is part of cascading style sheets, and we'll see what that looks like. And this will allow us to do different things like font size, and these are properties about how the individual element is actually displayed. So let's go look at this in the browser. We'll see that it got rather large, and the text is now much larger. We can also do things like width 200 pixels for an example. And that will specify exactly how wide this should be. Now, doing this on an individual tag is interesting, but we really want this on a bunch of items. So we could go down here and copy them into each of these. But of course, anytime this changed, it would require me finding every place I did this. So copy and paste is probably not what we want. Instead, let's move it to the page. So here in the head, we can actually create a style element. This will apply to things on this page. And the way it works is you need to set up a rule set. A rule set are a list of those properties we just looked at, and then some instruction about what to apply it to. So in our case, I'm just going to say input, and that input's going to be the name of individual tags. We put curly braces around it, and then we just add each of these individual styles into that. So this is going to effectively find all the inputs on the page and apply this style to it. If we look at that, we can now see that all three of these are now 200 width with the big font. But we can also see that it's done the same to the input that happens to be a button. So we can actually get around this in a minute, but let's worry about why the message isn't that wide. If we look at this being a style for the inputs, we'll notice that text area isn't an input, right? It's only applying it to the things that have the name input. So we can add a comma here to add other elements like text area. So this will apply these to both of these. That's what the comma indicates, is one or more types of elements to apply it to. It's now the same size as the rest of this. It should be the large font as well. And we could create a new rule set for things like the label. We'll tell it font size 16. We can even add another rule set to apply to everything on the page, like body. And here we can do things like font family, which is what font to use. And it gives you some suggestions, or you could pick anything on your particular machine. I'm just going to pick Sego UI, since that's one of the lists. And this ends up being what can it find on your machine. So this is a list of different fonts. So if I'm on a Windows machine, that's probably going to be found, at least on a recent Windows machine. Maybe an older Windows machine will have Tahoma in case Sego isn't found. And if neither of those are found, it'll drop back to Geneva for data. And at the end of it, it'll just say any sans serif font will do. If we can't find any of these specific fonts, let me pick exactly the one I want. So if we refresh, we can see all the fonts have changed to be that sans serif sort of font. And so we're able to make that change sort of wholesale. Now the problem with this is going to be on a page-by-page basis. And what if I really wanted to share it across different pages? It's not important now, but it probably will be eventually. And so the best practice is to not use styles and tags or style elements or style blocks in the head like I'm showing you here. Instead, you're going to want to create a new file in the CSS, and I'll just call it site.css for lack of a good word. And I'll just copy the same text in here. And so this ends up being a separate file that contains all the description of how to render my page. And instead of a style element here, we can just drag this into our project to create a link to the style sheet itself. So both files are going to be downloaded, and then the CSS is going to be applied to it. So let's make sure it still works. Woohoo, it does. And let's talk about one more piece that's important here. If you remember, we're getting this large send message that's much wider than we might want a button. It might look okay, but it's probably not what I really want. And that's because here we told it for all inputs, make this change. CSS is applied top down, just like HTML is. So if I had just said, let's make this another rule for input, but make it width 500, just so you can see how big it is. We can see it made just the inputs 500 wide. And why is that? Let's use the developer tools to see what's actually happening. If we show the input here in our HTML, one of the things you're going to see in the rules here are the different things that are applied. So this input was applied and this input was applied because we got font size from here. And we'll see that this is scratched out. And that's because this one cascaded over this one. It's trying to apply all of them. So when it looks at this individual input, we're actually applying the body rule, the input and text area rule, and the second input because it was lower down on the page. The other rule that's important here is that we can specify the specific type of input we want to handle here, and I'm going to say auto. And what auto is going to do is say, just make it as wide as you need to. Don't use this fixed width anymore, just make it auto-sized. But we're limiting it to this more specific rule than this rule is. So if we refresh, we'll see that this send message is here, and that's because this input doesn't apply that. And if we look at our submit button, we'll see that this more specific input was applied and counteracted the width of the regular input. And so in this way, we can have exceptions. The trick here is, though, this seems like it would be a no-brainer because this happens after the input. But in fact, cascades have a rule, and that rule is that the more specific rule wins over the more general rule. Because this one has a type to submit, it's actually going to win over the input, even though here in the CSS sheet, it is before it. And that's because this is more specific than just the name input. And so that we can have these exceptions or overrides for these individual types of CSS anywhere we want. So we talked about creating rules based on the structure types or the tags themselves inside the HTML. Let's go one step further. So now let's talk about naming in CSS. If we come back over to the HTML, we can see that we have this form. Let's wrap this form in a div. Let's say what we want is the background of this form to be gray. So we look at site.css, we might think to just go ahead and create a selector for div and say background color equals, let's say, light gray. Now, colors in CSS are interesting because there are some named colors, but you can also pick a syntax that starts with a pound, and this syntax is the red, green, and blue hexadecimal values. So if I did 000000, that would of course be 0 in all the red, green, and blue channels and give us a black. Visual Studio has this nice little picker, so we can actually pick a very specific colors. So it doesn't matter what color, because I'm going to pick a gray, and I'm just going to go up here. That'll be good enough. And we can see that gives us a preview of the color as being fairly light gray. So let's press save. I'm going to get rid of the debugger and just press refresh, and we'll see that we get gray everywhere. We just wanted it on this form. The reason that doesn't work is that we're matching everything that's a div. So if you looked, the Dutch street wasn't gray because it was not collected in a div, but we have two divs here and they're both being made as gray. Well, if we're going to use div as sort of this divider, this way to define a block, we need to have a different way to do that. And the first way is to use names. So we can specify the ID for a div, and we'll just call this the form, or the form if you prefer that naming convention. I like the JavaScript-y sort of convention. And then over here in the CSS, instead of saying div, I can actually use the pound as the beginning, and that is a selector to say, go find me a named element. The pound says whatever's after the pound will be the name of the element. So if I say the form, and then I come back here and refresh, then the rule is only going to apply here to the form itself. Back in the CSS, we could actually have this only on a div called form. So you can have these two levels, the name of the element, pound, the name of the actual ID. And the space being there does matter. So if we refresh, it should continue to display it because it's looking for the div named form in that case. Let's get rid of the div there. There is another type of selector, of way to know how to apply these rules that's important. Up here we had specified that the width of the input is auto, but let's say the form and then say input type equals submit again. By default, it's going to indent it because it's trying to help you find these. And the idea here is that the form has a child of it that is an input submit. This allows you to specify rules that are more specific to a part of a page, like the form in our case. Maybe we didn't want to set all of these properties for every input and text area and submit button in the project, but only this specific form. And so here, let's say background color equals green. Color, which is the foreground color, let's make white. And if we refresh it, we can see it's now applying itself to this because it's the input submit inside of our form. And so being able to specify these relationships between child and parent becomes pretty crucial when you're designing CSS. And you'll see that more and more as we go forward. So now let's talk about classes in CSS. If you're used to languages that support the idea of classes, this is not what that is. This is a whole nother idea. Let's go to the HTML and talk about this. So here the form has an ID, and IDs are meant to be unique within an HTML document. So if I had more than one place I wanted to apply this, I really couldn't do that. I would have to have a bunch of different IDs that were all unique. And in place of that is the idea of a class. So let's come up here to the unordered list. Let's add a class attribute, and let's call it product props for properties. The class could be applied to every UL out there that we need to be a product's property. So the idea of class is to say this is a type of this element, not this is this specific element. That's the big difference between IDs and classes. This class is to select more than one element on a page, whereas IDs are meant to point at one specific element on a page. If we come back over here to our CSS, class is denoted by the period instead of the pound, and I'll just say product props. Same type of rule set structure. And I'm just going to say font size small, which is just a browser and specific version of that. Let's see what it looks like. We can see that the font got a bit smaller and that we can actually use that. We could also say UL period props. And this is because this is a product props that is for unordered lists only. Back here in the browser, we'll see that it maintains that property. But what if we had a space? Should space be significant there? You can see it goes away and it doesn't match anymore. And I told you the reason earlier, and that's because when there's a space, this is really saying that this is a child of this. And that's not what it is. If we look at the HTML, UL has a product props. It's not that child elements have the class of product props. And so that space becomes pretty important in CSS until you'll want to actually use it. And you can continue this ul.productprops li for the list element. And again, notice there's a space there because we want to say for the list items inside of our product props unordered list, what do we want to do there? We're going to say list style type, and I'm just going to say none. And this is going to be a property that says what kind of bullet do we want to use. And I actually don't want any bullet. I just want it to show the price and descriptions and titles and whatever it is directly below our title. Notice it still has the indentation, which we could fix as well, but this should give us a basic idea of how classes would work. Because if we look at the HTML, if we were to repeat this div for every product we have in a certain page, we'd still be able to apply that product props to that class of unordered list, not just for that individual unordered list. We have this specific property. This makes it easier to do selections or selectors towards more than one object at once and to apply that style to all of them. So let's talk about the box model next. It's one of the more confusing pieces of the way that CSS works, and something you'll want to get familiar with and at least be able to refer to. So in CSS, we have this concept of the box model. The box model is how elements on a page are spaced. So when we think about the total width of an object, the total height of an object, what properties in the CSS affect that in what ways? Let's assume you have content like content of the product box that we created earlier. We also have this property called padding, which is the space between the content and the container it's in. And outside of that, we have the border and then margin above that. The difference between padding and margin is in between this element and the next element. Padding is in between the border and the content. So both numbers are taken into account. So when we think about this, we also talk about the 4 directions as far as how far it is from any of the 4 directions. So how much space in the top, the left, the bottom, or the right. And then when we think about the properties of height and width, they're just the content. They don't include any of this other stuff. But when we talk about actual width and actual height, it takes everything but the margin into account. So the actual height is the height plus the padding plus the size of the border. The actual width is the width of the content plus the size of the padding and the size of the border. The margin in the top, margin in the left, margin in the bottom, they aren't taken into account when we look at the actual height of an element and the actual width of an element. Let's see this in practice. So if we look at this block that we want to format here, since we can't use just div as the name of the thing we want to style, we're going to need to give it a name or a class. So I'm going to give it a class name of product info. And then over here in site, I can just go ahead and add .product info as a rule for this div element. Not necessarily anything inside of it, but just the div element. So let's start by just creating a border. And I'm going to say how big the border is, what kind of border, in this case solid, and then I'm just going to call it gray. And if we take this, because we've assigned the product info class, we should be able to see that our element is as wide as the page. And the reason it is by default, divs are displayed in a type called block. And a block is going to take as much horizontal space as possible, because it's a block where other blocks can't cover it left to right. This is one of the reasons why it's being displayed pretty much top to bottom, our HTML, because all those div elements are taking up as much horizontal space as possible and as little vertical space as the contents in them will allow them to. So let's change that. Because we might want these to be next to each other eventually, let's go display inline block. It's a type of block that says you might want more than one next to each other. So you can now see this line is just around our content. But of course it's right next to it because of the size of the image. That's what's really dictating the width. That's the widest thing in our content. But we'd like to be able to shove it out a little. And that's where padding comes in. So if we say padding 5 pixels, when we refresh, the content got shoved in by 5 pixels. So we can see that 5 pixels from the top, left, right, and even bottom where the button was were all separated in that way. And we may not want them uniform. CSS has a way of specifying left, right, top, and bottom, and you can certainly do it with separate properties. So we can say padding left 5 pixels, and then repeat that for all 4 of them. But another common way is to actually use multiple properties here. And so what you'll actually see is that it starts with top and then goes right, bottom, and then left. So if we give it 4 values, we'll actually see that top and bottom are 5 and left and right are only 3. If we see this, we can see that the size on the left and right is a bit smaller than the size on the top and bottom. We can actually abbreviate that. If we only give it 2 values, it assumes that this is top and bottom and this is left and right. So in our case, let's make this 8 so we can see it better and just 2 on the sides. And there we can get a better sense of what padding's actually doing. Of course, this div element is right up next to our form. There's no space between it at all. And that's where the idea of margin comes in. Margin uses the same syntax, top, right, bottom, and left, but it's specifying the size outside of the border. So in our case, let's just say 2 pixels all around for the margin. And we'll see that this will get pushed down a little, and this will get pushed further down. That's because we're creating a margin outside from the left, the top, the right, and the bottom. The only one we can really see is the difference between the form and us. And if you look carefully, you'll actually see that it's in from the left because the side of the form is a little to the left of the side of the actual content object. So let's look at another way of doing margin. If we come and create another rule for product info, but for image, because we know that info is going to have an image, we can add another margin here for how far to give around just the image. Let's say 3 pixels to be easy. And we can see that it's just pushed this guy from the corners. Really hasn't affected any of the other content here. It's just given it a little bit more room. And let's make a couple of other changes. So back in our product info, let's go ahead and set the width of our object at about 450 pixels. Should be using other non-specific sizes for a lot of this, but for now, pixels are an easy way to think about it. And if we look at it, we can now see that we're taking a lot of room, but everything's left justified. I'd love to be able to bring this up in here, and I could do that by creating divs and all those sorts of things, but I'm going to use something different. Instead, I'm going to come down to the image and add a float. The reason that this flows on the bottom is because it treats this as its own display block, so it's taking up all this horizontal room. And so the next available thing to show is over here. What float does is tell it to float here and take the space I need, but don't necessarily stop things from being displayed on my right. I'm just going to take available space, much like creating an image or some other object that you want to wrap text around in a word processor. It's that same idea. We can change this to float right if that's more of the design we want, and it's the same idea. It's going to move all the way to the right and try to display itself. But let's set it back to left. Let's add a couple more properties that'll be interesting. First, let's go ahead and add a border, just so that our product is actually bordered. You can see a very thin border there. And let's set its max width so that no matter what the product is, we can have the size of the image be predictably the same size. So if we end up with one giant product image or one small product image, that we're limiting it to take up a certain amount of real estate. And I'll set that at 150 for now. So it made it a little smaller, and again, we're getting that same content here on the left that we used to take for granted. And let's change a couple more things about the info. Let's give it a background color of light gray. And let's give it a border radius. This is a property that will round the corners for us, and let's say about 5 pixels. So we can now see it's gray, we can see it's rounded. So we're starting to really put together some of the ideas about how we want to stylize each of these elements. And with CSS, it gives us the power to do a lot of this while separating the structure that we may write code against later from the actual display characteristics. So we don't get caught up in trying to have the structure of a page, which should be fairly easy to read, very different from the actual design elements. Now, getting used to a language like CSS is going to take some doing, but later on we'll look at Bootstrap as a way to sort of kickstart that. But we're still going to need to know CSS to override some of the ways that Bootstrap works. Let's wrap up this module.
So what have we learned? I've introduced you to the idea of the HTML is the structure of your page, that each of the elements inside HTML will help you produce and structure what you want to show to your users. We've also seen how CSS will allow you to describe how you want to render that structure. That while HTML is the structure, CSS is the way it's painted on the screen. I've also shown you how to keep them separate, and that this is the right way forward so that your code is more maintainable. Next up, we're going to be diving into JavaScript.